we think that because we have stability in the past, we will have in the future. We need the modernization of prediction. Government's saying, I don't have the answer to this question because it's a question that has no historical blueprint. So I can only hypothesize, and I will try to run experiment based on assumptions.
Welcome to the PolicyNet podcast by the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab. This is the place where top thinkers come to talk data and solutions that reset us along a more fair and smart path. Today our guest is Mark Esposito. He's a professor at Hull International Business School and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Mark is a leading expert on crisis and resilience, and this is exactly what we're discussing today. In turmoil, resilience matters, and Mark tells us how exactly we can be building it into our systems.
The number of shocks will continue to increase. So first is whether or not systems are being designed with the inherent or implicit fragility. The other one is the agility in the governance structure.
Mark said that we should allow our governments and systems to be less risk-averse and to openly learn from failure.
There is a lot of destigmatization that we need to do on the concept of failure. Sometimes the speed of responding to a crisis and pivoting is more important on how accurate our response is.
Mark goes beyond diagnosing issues and pitches concrete solutions.
And I love for government to be able to use innovation to understand how regulatory frameworks need to eventually establish some trade-offs based on the mechanism that is necessary for a specific construct to be tested moving forward.
I'm UNESCO's Yulia Shevchuk, and I'm your host here. Mark, there is much talk about converging crisis these days and the need to drastically regroup and reshape our systems to go beyond the crisis mode in which we are currently operating towards true resilient, agile, adaptable and adaptive systems. Now, that's the focus of your work, and one of your recent books is all about that. So let's start with that. Beyond rhetoric, what is, in concrete terms, a truly resilient system? What should we be building and emulating?
Thanks for kicking this off with this, Julia. Resilience is really the acceptance that we're no longer coming from a period of time where we're largely going to have normative behavior in terms of policy, standards, institutional frameworks, and expecting that there will be a certain level of control on the next few years because we think that because we have stability in the past, we will have in the future. Likely the number of shocks will continue to increase, and the response that is required to navigate the shocks is a form of resilience in itself. And so rethinking fundamentally our role as civil society and governments, I think they play a role in this, equally do private organizations, in trying to also change the narrative about, well, how do we deal with the period of our history, which is largely unsettling. That's in a nutshell what the book does, what the work I do, what kind of the workshops that I try to bring forward. We're trying to educate, I would say, to a different set of opportunities rather than just scaring people that the world has changed and now, we're doomed. We are not.
So what are the markers of a resilient system, if you were to sum up the key ones?
So I think the first is whether or not systems are being designed with the inherent or implicit fragility. We have an expectation that we have a positive or negative correlation between past and future. That's a form of fragility because we are to some extent thinking that there will be a moment of preparation or preparedness that is required to meet the expectation of the future. And of course, the future tends to be more complex than what we anticipate. I think the entire expectancy on what we think an institution should do is a marker if we are largely using historical data to model our response in terms of options. The other one is the agility in the governance structure. And that is a critical part because we tend to have systems that we have inherited from the industrial conglomerate. So from our education system to the way governments function, first of all, there's a sense of risk aversion that is largely driven by the fact that innovation was not part of the proposition. It was mainly operational, I would say diligence. And then later on, it became effectiveness and efficiency. But today it's much more about rethinking those processes in terms of fast decision makings without necessarily operating with the assumption that decision making must be successful per se. So there's a lot of pivoting, and the sandbox is also the government level. And that requires a cultural shift in understanding and accepting this sense of volatility that is now permeating our life.
So what I hear you saying is that we need to be building our systems or rebuilding with two criteria in mind. One is the expectation, solid expectations and openness to change. And another one, the inbuilt capability to be agile and innovate and reinvent themselves.
Look, these are two of, I think, the critical constituents of a resilient society. You also, of course, have the culture. There is a lot of destigmatization that we need to do on the concept of failure that is largely captivating into an event, flow or continuum, which is like an unfair representation of how things really happen. I think we need to have a better sense that sometimes the speed of responding to a crisis and pivoting is more important on how accurate our response is. We will eventually talk more about it during our conversation, but government needs to start thinking in terms of specificity, not in terms of accuracy. And so crisis has specific dimension that can be studied. They don't need to be accurate or basically precise, but they have to be specific. And so there's a set of engagement on the complexity of crisis that I think needs to shape into public policy. It has to shape in the education of public servants. And he has to shape in how we keep on reshoring markets by using the same binary logic that we've been using for decades. I find there's a lot of mismatches somehow, but I don't find it to be guilty or guilty action. There are accidental legacies that we have from a system that has never been tested or stress tested for this kind of challenge that we're facing right now.
Well, thank you very much. And you are raising a couple of points on which I do have follow-up questions, so I'll come to those later. But let's talk about government specifically now. So you work on systems in general in different sectors, but now you're mentioning government, and that's indeed what interests us the most, as a big part of our audience comes from public sector, public administrations. So tell us, how is the situation now? Where do you think governments in general stand now in terms of being resilient and agile and innovative and everything you just described?
I would say the rule of thumb that the small is beautiful is proving to be fundamentally on the right side of history. Many small countries these days are thriving, and they're doing it because, of course, they don't have the same complexity in large countries. I think that first is really a number problem. And second is because they have found a way to probably deal by reconciling what we call the federal level and the municipal level. So cities, in many circumstances, are largely driving economic development, social progress, and the sense of equity that we need to have. And the conversation on how do you apply what we're talking about in terms of resilience is much more experienced at the municipal level than what is at the federal level. And so if I have to give you some examples, I'm currently spending a good amount of time in the Middle East. This is a difficult region and it's also a flourishing region, right? It's kind of happening at the same time. And so you have cities in the UAE, to some extent in Qatar after the embargo with Doha. You see this now with Saudi Arabia. You see this in some of the development in Muscat in Oman. These cities have largely taken on. I see this, for example, with Dubai that was impacted heavily by financial crisis first and later on by a crisis of liquidity because investment were not coming in. This is a mobility hub. So if you have an event like COVID and then you have a supply chain crisis and you have in conflict and now you have in the Gaza and Israel situation, what do you do? And this city is largely moving to its next scale of maturity by shifting to digital economy, by rethinking trade in digital forms, by reopening and revamping their financial sector. It happened at the city level. You can say that not the entire country benefits from what the city has done, and you can still see asymmetries, but that's an example. We saw this in some communities in South Korea during COVID, that they were pivoting the use of what we call in policy the universal basic income, but through digital cards, they were trying to reanimate local businesses. So they were not paid as cash, but they were mainly, let's say, vouchers or coupons. They were programmed to be spent all in local neighborhoods. Today, cities like Seoul, although difficult for their cost of living spikes, they are testing the 15-minute cities. So where people start having a sense of livelihood that is rehumanizing us in many ways. You see this across some areas in Europe as well. Countries like Switzerland have been able to navigate for hundreds of years the complexity of big countries around them. We are seeing the rise of startup ecosystems where innovation was basically bringing incredible solution moving forward. And you can argue even in countries like the UK, you have London downsizing as a result of their decision to exit the common market, but then cities like Birmingham, or to some extent Manchester, pioneering the smart city, becoming a lively, vibrant city for research. And then you can go to Lisbon and you can see how a country that was on the brink of a possible default in 2010-11 is now one of the most sophisticated hub for bioscience, and researchers flocking to the region. And there are more examples, Julia, but we are in the presence of a reapproachment of policy on the ground, driven fundamentally by cities at the expenses of a fundamental failure of the federal system in many parts of the world.
Thank you very much. What you're saying resonates with a number of other experts who came on our podcast. And I'm just thinking, you mentioned universal basic income, and we had Sarah Davala talking about the pilots and the policy experiments, indeed the majority of which are conducted at subnational levels, city levels, creating this critical mass that then bubbles up and generates bigger results. Same, we just had a podcast with Charles Landry on government innovation and reinvention of government. And again, he was talking about cities. So yes, that's interesting and relevant. Now, if you are to identify really key skills and capacities and capabilities you think the governments are lacking at the moment, again, to be agile, to face the crisis, to govern a crisis and pull through, what would be those skills and capacities?
I'll try to base my answer supported by the experience I had across regions. I would say data literacy on the understanding of data as a form of the prompting of decision making, not necessarily decision making by itself, but prompting is critical. Many countries do not have, I would say, a solid and sound way to collect proper data. They sometimes collect data that they want to collect, and sometimes they leave gaps in the data because when data is full and thorough, it becomes politicizable. So I would say data is a challenge in terms of the literacy required because it changes the understanding of phenomenon on the ground that might be understood within a number of different hypotheses that might be tested, discarded, eventually proven, depending on what we're looking for. But it goes back to the fact that data is also critical for the formulation of hypotheses that is driving experiments, which is what we need so much these days. So I would say data literacy is probably where skills are largely required. And I think it's important to say and the entire humanistic side of life in a society where we are largely challenged by a cybernetic era where technology is so much permeating our life. Creating a space and a narrative for debate based on human value, as inefficient as humans are, is important as we are moving into data literacy. So I find it to be part of two sets of skills that sometimes they tend to belong to two different groups of people, but I love to see them eventually integrated. So this humanizing form of using data for decision making. Otherwise, what we end up doing is digitizing the same challenge we have in financialized economics or the industries in which we were giving power to the numbers to be the ultimate decision or the ultimate judgment on things without necessarily looking at the context. And I think context these days is so important because most of the events that we're dealing with, because they're so complex, they require more than one line of explainability. They require entirely contextual analysis. So the ability to navigate the two, I think also makes data much more interesting. You start realizing maybe gaps that might inspire more measurements. And it is within reach, which I think is a gift we have in this generation, is that for most of the challenges we're dealing with, technology is available. It's different from when back in the days, technology was aspirational. We do really need to navigate this in terms of skills. So closing gaps, there's an entire world of training that needs to be put in place. And equally, of course, the political will to go in that direction. Because when you are creating that sense of power, you equally are increasing the accountability capital on this.
Again, very hard to disagree. It feels like preaching to the choir. Indeed, a lot of what we do is actually building in government capacities to use and navigate the new landscapes of data in and for governance, which is a challenge that cannot be underestimated and applies to both global south and global north. I wouldn't say that the gap is only on one side and we can point fingers. Now, Mark, I would like to go back to what you said, and I find very relevant and interesting, the concept of failure. In a way, what you said reminded me of Taleb. He was saying that probably one of the best books he read was, I may misquote the title, but it was something along the lines, What I Learned by Losing a Million. So what we actually learn from failure, how we factor in those lessons learned, how open and honest we are, especially in the context of bureaucracies. And I speak from a bureaucracy. Governments are bureaucracies. They are generally risk averse. Generally, failure is not embraced and factored in as a learning curve for the future. So how do you see that changed, and why do you think it's indeed important to bank on this?
Many things are in your question. I'll try to approach some. The first is when you're integrating more technology in the data, you are disintermediating a lot, right? One of the benefits of technology is that disintermediation is quite immediate. And I think that helps to try to unburden layers of stratification of bureaucracy that are a representation of shifting trust and responsibility to a next, I would say, layer of decision making, which I think is historical. It is also coming from a period of time where enhancing trust was necessary against the fear of losing control over the public goods. And I think there is an historical legitimacy that we need to recognize as being obsolete. So let's improve government processes. Let's digitize what we can digitize. On the Taleb's point, I'm a fan. I know him personally, and he has inspired a lot of the work that I do. So Taleb talks about the fact that we need to build society capable of generating random stressors so that we are actually exposed to stress, but we have to collectively respond to stress so that we are building a collective action to this. And there's also the work of Steve Waddell that was writing some years ago about Global Action Network, GANs, and the idea that large challenges cannot be addressed by small entity, but we need to have a collective orchestration of actors, stakeholders. So I think dealing with the fact that fragility is a critical part of building the anti-fragility, and that happens by embracing random stress and eventually collectively answering to this. The idea that the collective answer justifies to some degree the failure, which I think in some aspects, like in entrepreneurship, is very clear. In some branches of finance, that's also very clear. In policy, we don't. And one of the reasons why, for example, we're still very hesitant to let banks fail is because we hypothetically believe that the best thing government should do is to restore liquidity by using public money to cover private debt. But as a matter of fact, I think it's also reinforcing a sense of alleged fragility that is not letting system fail. So there's a whole set, I think, of conversation on how do we build that inbuilt fragility as part of our learning model so that we can learn to enhance. And there are industries that do this very well. I would say the aviation industry in its own history has now one of the lowest rate of incidents in the world, and it has a significant number of people that are using aerial transportation to move. That happened because every single accident that we had, we have improved the standards. You can say that in many industries today, we are better off because we have somehow embraced failure as a mechanism of improving the collective performance. In some areas, we don't do this. In some of the government policy, we don't do this. At the central governments, we don't do that. In banking, we don't do that. So I think it's about expanding to those critical areas where the assets are to some extent controlled. First of all, disintermediate as much as you can. So you're removing that layers and also start building some inbuilt fragility because you want the collective answer to come. And it comes from the way we're teaching children in schools, to the way we are assessing people, to the way we are building KPIs and mobilities, to the way policies are designed to incentivize risk by protecting the weakest member of our society. So there's a lot of work that can be converted into design.
Thank you very much. And you are mentioning several words and they link in a very interesting way. You say trust, failure, and then somehow it leads me to COVID and governing for the crisis. We have a whole work stream on trust in science, crisis of expertise, how COVID feeds into that, how COVID impacted that, how we came out of that crisis with overexposure of science, politicization of science, scientization of politics, and so on and so forth. Science, by default, is an iterative process, is a failure-embracing process and medium. Yet even that wasn't spared criticism during COVID. And if you go back to trust, so much policy uptake and buy-in has suffered as a result of perceived failure. It wasn't necessarily a failure, it was a perceived failure. So how do you see this failure actually built into the policy processes and their interface with the publics?
I tend to differentiate it in governments who, for a number of reasons, tend to steer by truth as being of a higher order of priority than information. That's because truth has a higher value system in a given country. It's in the value code of a country. Truth is unequivocal. And there are governments that are swinging by information echo chambers. They're largely algorithmic, where truth has more than one side, one interpretation. And when truth is becoming debatable, it's difficult because then it eventually become a form of polarization. Two opposite ideas cannot coexist. They exclude themselves. And that polarization eventually becomes radical. And when you're adding a political sentiment to that, it becomes a radical ideology, which is unfortunately what we see in many parts of the world. And that's because we have no mechanism of defense against the echo chamber of information that are basically misinformation. The difference between information, misinformation on one side and truth is where I find the main difference. And let me tell you why. In governments where truth is still important, we still debate and we find some form of convergence regardless of our political ideology. And when you debate and you find convergence, some of this, they become universally important challenges that we're facing. And this is really what I think in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, we were able to do with the rise of this institutional player that really helped to elevate the conversation by saying we globally have challenges, right? We globally want to address some of the things. Today, to quote Parakana, who is a geostrategy that we co-interviewed in our book, we are converging and fragmenting at the same time. And the fragmentation is coming with tribalism. And so tribalism is equally supported by the fact that if your tribe tends to build an information echo chamber, that becomes by itself a form of defense from whoever is different from you. And these are, I think, the major challenges that social media has not really helped us to reconcile. On the contrary, it's created even more dissonance. And this is what we have to rapidly correct. We have to govern like we govern tobacco companies, where we govern food. And we have largely improved the ability for people to make choices. Today, I think we don't really have that. And I think that is where we should, as a society, go back to say truth doesn't have two sides, it's unequivocal. And based on truth, we can then debate on application, on implication, on ramification, on interpretation. But I find this lack of sense of convergence towards absolute truth is very difficult. And it challenges governments where there are democratic models. Because the moment that democracy is my own interpretation of public goods, because I have certain kind of access that you don't have. When I go vote, I represent an entirely different set of values that are almost dissonant from yours. And it's difficult to govern a country or countries where you have eroded the center in many ways, that space for debate. This is where I call my readers or my students to that kind of activism to find truth over information. I would say it's important and, in my humble opinion, not largely discussed yet.
Again, what you're saying resonates with what we've been discussing with other experts. We had Hilde Suniga and Brigitte Hubert here, who have conducted a large study on correlation of social media use and trust in science. And they actually say that there is a positive correlation. More social media use is indeed better for trust in science. And that what surprised many is that they were saying that actually the amount of fake news when it comes to science is very low on social media, but the concentration effects are really worrisome. And that goes back to what you were saying about the echo chambers and about polarization, about the concept of truth itself, what is factual and what is not factual, and how it impacts not only trust, but democracies in general. Let's move on to another side of the story, and something you work on is foresight and the need for the government, again, to build these skills internally. So tell us, please, how exactly you see these capacities built within the governments, and again, where they stand and where they should be going towards and how they should be reforming.
First of all, foresight has been around for many decades, but it has really become a protagonist in the last few years, given the challenge we were having in this large discontinuity with our present that was showing to become wicked in many ways. I would say there's a larger acceptance on future studies from the Dubai Future Foundation that is now generating a forum every year, inviting people to study the future. And there are important statements that are sometimes emblematic, but they are important because they are told in public forum. For example, Spain, that as a country during COVID was able to institutionalize the Office of Strategic Foresight, actually led by Diego Rubio, who used to be a colleague of Manuel Muniz, who is also somebody that you interviewed. Of course, in Singapore, this has been a practice, but in general terms, foresight is a serious effort to think of the future with a clear deviation from the dependency on the past. And there's a field of anticipatory study, anticipatory trends, in understanding the forces of anticipation to determine what will happen tomorrow. They're equally in the present, so we can understand them. But also, the future can be constructed differently from how we eventually have constructed the present or the past. And so I think there are multiple facades to the idea of foresight. There is the modernization of prediction, no longer as a prediction from what happened in the past in terms of extrapolation, but more about looking at the anticipation of today to understand tomorrow. There is the sense of options in terms of construction of the future as a form of future equity. You're going to build what you don't have. And there's an entire narrative that comes from people like Stephanie Kelton, who wrote about the modern monetary theory that is supported by Mariana Mazzucato, who's another friend, has also come to the podcast, where she thinks about the mission-based economy, where how do we use moonshots to inspire radical ideas that will fundamentally change, right, the constructs. I think this is where foresight really plays. It doesn't play in isolation. It's not just a strategic tool to build scenarios. This is the trivial part. Is a driver for instigation of options that we have ahead of us by unburdening us from dependency from the past, by creating the view that tomorrow can be very different. And so if you're looking at the challenges that we have, we could eradicate them if we want to. It just that requires a challenge in the system that builds the problems in the first place. And then he attached to the system analysis, the ability to see the interaction between elements. How are they connected? Do I now start having significant level of leverage points that are concentrated so I can focus my action at the policy level? Is a big conversation, but foresight is becoming an important part of my work. And I think it's also deserve upgrading of foresight on the center stage, with also governments now openly practicing this.
Indeed, everyone is talking about foresight. Everyone is talking about how we can feasibly integrate this in our public administrations. You outlined very well the continuum, let's say a spectrum, from very rigid, scenario-oriented, older style foresight to collective intelligence and all bubbling up coming from grassroots, so to say. What do you think on this spectrum is the best solution? What is actually feasible and what governments should be trying to build within their systems when it comes to foresight?
I think if government could shift to the perception that government can build returns on public value using the same language that private investor know very well. And sandboxes are incredible forms of, say, testing ideas on the ground, collecting feedback, and honoring that markets are always more complex than governments or corporations. So there is a sense of humility in understanding that not because you have a group of smart people in the room that they can synthesize the reality of the world. The world needs to be understood and experienced. So I think sandboxes have been a way for government to have a narrative with the markets that is very dynamic. I think this is really the way to go. Government saying, I don't have the answer to this question because it's a question that has no historical blueprint. The data tends to be collective in aggregate forms from the past, and I cannot make decisions based on the past. So I can only hypothesize, and I will try to run experiment based on assumptions. It's shifting into this multi-logic rather than monologic. And if government is able to allocate resources to that, run experiments and pilots, grants, empowering some of the NGO that are on the ground with specific programs that are supported by fiscal policy discount or rebate, the inventiveness of this is quite wide. I think we can discover important things. And also, government does not have a role of creation of value, but it has a huge role in facilitation of value. And that's where maybe government funding can go. Maybe we can bring investors that will accelerate solution from the market up that will address a specific challenge. I come from the school of thought of Professor Michael Porter at Harvard. I mean, he was my mentor for about 9 years. And so in cluster theory, you really start understanding that the collaborative behavior across multiple firms eventually generate the level of innovation, but it is also very accidental. It's just that the proximity makes that happen. And the proximity is experimental in many ways. So if the private sector understands this when it's integrated by public agency, NGO research, I think sandboxes is probably the way to go. And I personally believe it's the only way we have to tap on dimension of public life that are so new that needs to be tested and understood rather than hypothesized out of, I would say, a more elitist approach, which is what we had done in more traditional academic sense in the past.
As you were speaking, I was thinking it takes a special kind of government and a special kind of society for the government to come openly and say, we don't know the answer, let's experiment and try to innovate together and see where it takes us, especially in times of crisis. That's how we started this whole podcast. Do you think that there is a role in this for research communities and knowledge communities and civil society, not strictly in terms of NGO development style work, but in terms of knowledge generation and running experiments and policy pilots, to actually not absorb that risk and damage, so to say, itself, the public administration, its reputation and trust, but basically partner with these institutions and allow them to run these experiments and allow them to innovate so that then the government absorbs the best solutions they develop in its policy making.
I think the researchers or the research community plays a vital role. Maybe I'm biased, right? I come from that contingent. First of all, I love the fact that we start noticing what we call academic practitioners, which are people that are engaged in the expansion of existing theory rather than necessarily in the construction of theory. And not because I think that construction theory is bad, but construction of theory sometimes serves a smaller group of constituents. testing a theory is a profound conversation to have because you're testing whether theoretical models really work. So if we can start building a generation of researchers that are using the access to research to test theory in the real world and understanding phenomena so that we have a contextual model to understand how theory applies to phenomena, then I believe we are going to be able to discover blind spots that currently are outside of our field of vision. That's when we need the financial sector capitals to maybe animate access to the innovators. That's where we need the government on the local level to create an inset of ecosystem that is populated by startup. And that's when we need to bring investor from the government perspective that will help us get validation from the market. Or you can start building joint venture between large and smaller company because you are redefining the concept of innovation being organic and coming from the ground rather than being elitist and coming from an R&D department, which is heavily funded, right? But it's also so far from the reality. So labs, greenhouses, rainforests, these are kind of the analogy I like to have in redefining the research for this kind of important challenges. I tend to say, let's find problem of practice and let's use research to address them by maybe testing theory. And that practical research mantra is needed more than ever because historically practitioners did not come from research. Researchers were hardly getting into practice. It's also how their system was incentivized to reward them. Today we have a generation of people that can be both. And I am hoping that this community of researchers that maybe is also part of the followers of the podcast can feel that the power research has in testing theory is huge and trying to explain, right, more and more. And then it becomes a form of dissemination of theory into digestible ways. It's a way of engaging public forum. It's how you engage in local communities. That's how you're going to schools and engaging youth. I find that to put a final point on this, Julia, we are in such a dire need of a new collective story and that we don't necessarily have it. And that collective story can only be formulated if we attempt to understand the world better.
Yes, I fully agree with you. And I think anecdotally, we see a lot of evidence of that applied research, that practice-oriented research, especially policy practice-oriented research. You're talking about big theories and then actually testing this. And we see that a lot happening in areas such as universal basic income or the 4-day work week. Again, there are big ideas and they have been debated over years. But then it comes to really on the ground policy experiments to then run it through reality checks, so to say, and feed it back into policy. And that leads us and brings us very neatly to the last part of this podcast. We always end with recommendations. We have here for an audience both researchers / knowledge producers and policymakers. If you are to speak fast to knowledge producers, what would be your recommendations? What do you think are knowledge gaps or areas they should be concentrating right now when it comes to building resilient systems and everything we talked about today?
So I find that the either cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary gaps are very visible. There is a policy that is hypothesized in economic theory that is in theory going to go and support, maybe a government action towards market. And then you have a group of people who are thinking about behavioral dimension and how we are largely shaped by different factors that eventually understand or help us understand the behavior on the ground. I'm always thinking, well, what if now the behavioral unit is kind of integrated into the economic unit and we start really looking at this? So I think this has been explored for many years, but in government to this day, there's still not a formal way of addressing behavioral data. The second is this behavioral data. How do we look at data as a representation of behavior and try to model? There's a knowledge gap between the large advancement we're doing in technologies and how it serves social purposes, like, for example, climate modeling for health, climate modeling for food, climate modeling for real estate. And these are all areas that I think can be understood. So it's not difficult to make the connection. but we don't have a formal way to really conduct this. We do have a corporate player that eventually rise and they provide unique value proposition of this nature. But I also think that many of those private players do not operate in every single market, but policy is easier to replicate. Government has so many opportunities to meet and exchange. There's so many fora and international conveyors where they participate. To some extent, communities of governments can learn from each other. Cities can learn from each other. And so how do we bring that space of intra topics or intra domains gaps and try to eventually reconcile? And back to what we were saying before, once you have created that intersectorial space, how do you drive experiment that are now expanding theory of more than one domain so that it's becoming equally in that case a transdisciplinary theory approach? So all of these, I think there are gaps that I would love to see reconciling more and more.
Now, if you are to address the second group, the policymakers, the decision makers, the public sector, what would be your 1, 2, 3 recommendations and pointers to them?
I would say to use innovation to understand how regulatory frameworks need to eventually establish some trade-offs, but those trade-offs are not reductionist or externalizing costs somewhere else. The trade-offs are based on the mechanism that is necessary for a specific construct to be tested moving forward. So sometimes government, they tend to stop innovation from happening because they fear. Sometimes government, they tend to wait and see what happens, but then markets, they don't have a logic of proper distribution of value because it's not how markets function. And I love for government to be able to play a role in between where they do govern and generate policy frameworks, but they don't base that on data per se because we don't know, but based on assumption that they can test and eventually modify and correct. But it's really for me this space where they are going to build the necessary trade-off for this mechanism to be tested on the ground. So trade-off as instrumental to the end game rather than trade-off as the end game. This is one of the things that I would love to see more coming from the policymakers.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mark. We are reaching the end, but it's been very interesting, and I hope to have you back at some point so that we touch on the points we didn't have a chance to discuss now.
Thank you for having me. This has been great. I really appreciate the conversation. I love the depth that we had, but equally the desire to make it actionable.
We reached the end of this podcast. For more deep debate and data-driven solutions, follow the PolicyNet podcast on all platforms.